A woman's worst nightmare on a transatlantic flight wasn't turbulence, but the man assigned to the seat next to her, or so she thought. In front of hundreds of passengers, Susan Pritchard launched a vitriolic racist tirade, refusing to sit next to a black man. The crew, caught between policy and outrage, eventually moved her. But hours later, at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic, a medical emergency call echoed through the cabin. A life was on the line, and the only person on board with the skill to save it was Dr. Thatcher Robertson, the very man she had publicly humiliated. This is the story of what happens when your bitter prejudice collides with your desperate need for a hero. The boarding process for British Airways Flight 288 from Houston to London was a familiar, organized chaos. The low hum of the Boeing 787 Dreamliner's engines was a comforting promise of adventure for some, a necessary evil for others. For Dr. Thatcher Robertson, it was simply the final leg of a long journey. He'd just spent 3 days at a cardiology conference presenting his research on non-invasive diagnostic techniques. He was exhausted, his mind a saturated sponge of data peer reviews and the lukewarm coffee that fueled medical conventions. Thatcher was a man of quiet presence. At 6'2", with a lean, athletic build, honed by years of disciplined morning runs, he could be imposing, but his demeanor was anything but. His eyes were kind, his smile infrequent but genuine, and he moved with the unhurried grace of someone completely confident in his own skin. He found his seat 17C, an aisle seat, in the premium economy cabin. He slid his leather briefcase under the seat in front of him, settled in, and pulled out a well-worn paperback, looking forward to disconnecting from the world of heart rhythms and sinking into a world of fiction. The flow of passengers continued. A young couple giddy with excitement found their seats across the aisle. An older gentleman with a kind face nodded a greeting as he passed. Then came the woman for seat 17B. She appeared to be in her late 50s, impeccably dressed in a beige linen suit that was likely worth more than Thatcher's entire outfit. Her hair was a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde, and her face was a mask of strained politeness. Her thin lips painted a severe shade of coral. She clutched a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. Her name, as Thatcher would soon learn, was Susan Pritchard. She stopped abruptly in the aisle, her gaze falling first on the seat number, then on Thatcher. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows knitted together. A flicker of something ugly disgust perhaps crossed her features before being quickly suppressed. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and carrying an unmistakable tone of privilege. She wasn't speaking to Thatcher, but past him, trying to flag down a flight attendant. Heather, a bright-eyed attendant with a name tag that identified her as the cabin supervisor, approached with a practiced, welcoming smile. "Everything all right, ma'am?" "I believe there's been a mistake," Susan Pritchard said, gesturing vaguely towards Thatcher. "This can't be my seat." Heather's smile didn't falter. She checked the boarding pass in Susan's hand. "It says 17B, ma'am. That would be the middle seat right here. Yes, I can see that." Susan snapped her voice, dropping to a conspiratorial yet somehow still loud whisper. "But I am not sitting there." She looked directly at Thatcher, for the first time her eyes sweeping over him in a clinical dismissive appraisal. "I would prefer another seat." Thatcher, who had been trying to ignore the exchange, finally lowered his book. He offered a neutral, polite nod. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm and even. Susan recoiled as if he had spat at her. She turned back to Heather, her face a thundercloud. "This is unacceptable. I paid for a premium ticket. I will not be crowded in for 9 hours next to him." The word him was laced with so much venom that it hung in the air thick and poisonous. The young couple across the aisle stopped their cheerful chatter. The businessman in the row behind, who had been tapping away on his laptop, looked up. The bubble of pre-flight anonymity had been pierced. Thatcher felt a familiar, weary tightening in his stomach. He had dealt with this his entire life, the subtle slights, the clutched purses, the overt aggressions. It never got easier. He just got better at controlling his reaction. Heather's professional smile was now strained. She understood the implication perfectly. "Ma'am, all the seats in this cabin are assigned. The flight is completely full. I'm afraid this is your designated seat." "Then you will find me another one," Susan demanded, her voice rising. "In business class, perhaps. I am a gold card member. I have standards. I will not be made to feel uncomfortable." Thatcher let out a slow, controlled breath. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him. He felt the dual pressures of wanting to stand up for himself and not wanting to cause a scene that would inconvenience everyone and likely end with him being painted as the aggressor. It was a tightrope he'd walked 1,000 times. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still low and steady, a surgeon's voice. "If you don't want to sit here, that's your prerogative. But I am in my assigned seat, and I have no intention of moving." Susan's head whipped back towards him. "I wasn't speaking to you," she hissed. She turned her fury back on Heather. "Are you going to do your job? Or do I need to speak to the captain? My husband is a very influential lawyer, Mr. Jonathan Pritchard of Pritchard, Klein and Associates. I assure you, he will not be pleased to hear about this failure in customer service." Heather's face paled slightly at the mention of a lawsuit, but her training held. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. You're holding up the boarding process." "I will lower my voice when I am given a seat that is satisfactory," Susan declared. The entire cabin was now silent save for the hum of the aircraft. Everyone was watching. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a spectacle. Susan Pritchard had drawn her line in the sand, and Dr. Thatcher Robertson, through no action of his own, was on the other side of it. He sat back, picked up his book, and fixed his eyes on the page, a portrait of calm he did not feel waiting for the inevitable escalation. The standoff in the aisle of row 17 had brought the delicate ballet of boarding to a screeching halt. Passengers further back were craning their necks, their grumbling about the delay slowly turning into murmurs of disbelief as the nature of the conflict became clear. Heather, the cabin supervisor, knew she was out of her depth. This wasn't a simple case of a disputed overhead bin. It was a toxic situation spiraling into a potential human rights issue. "One moment, ma'am," she said to Susan. Her voice tight and made a swift retreat towards the galley to consult with her colleagues. Thatcher kept his eyes on his book, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. He could feel the heat of dozens of stares. He heard a man behind him mutter, "For God's sake, just sit down." But another passenger, a woman a few rows up, whispered to her companion, "Well, you can't blame her for being cautious." The casual bigotry of that comment stung more than Susan's overt hatred. It was the quiet complicity that allowed the loud prejudice to flourish. Susan Pritchard stood her ground. Her arms crossed her designer bag, a barricade. She looked like a statue of indignation. She wasn't just a passenger with a complaint. She was a warrior for a cause only she seemed to comprehend. And she was prepared for a protracted battle. Heather returned this time with her superior, a stern-looking purser named George. He had the weary, no-nonsense air of a man who had seen everything. Mrs. Pritchard. George began his tone less conciliatory than Heather's. I understand there's an issue with your seating arrangement. There's an issue with your airline's inability to provide a safe and comfortable environment for its premium customers. Susan retorted, her voice dripping with condescension. I explained to your subordinate that this arrangement is not acceptable. George glanced at Thatcher, who met his gaze with a steady, impassive expression. George then looked back at Susan. Ma'am, our flight is 100% full tonight. There are no other seats available in this cabin or any other cabin. That sounds like a you problem, not a me problem, she snapped. Unacceptable. I want to speak to the captain. This was the nuclear option. Involving the flight deck for a seating dispute was a serious escalation. George's jaw tightened. The captain is preparing the aircraft for an on-time departure, ma'am. He cannot be disturbed. He will be disturbed if he wishes for his plane to leave the ground with me on it, Susan threatened. Make the call. The air crackled with tension. George, defeated for the moment, nodded curtly to Heather, who picked up an intercom phone in the galley. The entire cabin waited. Thatcher could only imagine the conversation happening in the cockpit. Captain Frank Miller would be getting a report that a passenger was refusing to sit next to another passenger based on race, a situation that was not only a customer service nightmare, but a potential security and legal minefield. A few minutes later, the captain's voice, calm and authoritative, came over the cabin PA system, but it was directed at only one person. This is Captain Miller. Mrs. Pritchard, I understand you have a concern with your seat. I need to inform you that we are on a tight schedule for departure. You have two options. You can take your assigned seat, 17B, and we can discuss any further complaints you have with customer relations upon landing in London, or you can choose to deplane, and we will book you on the next available flight. The ultimatum was clear. Sit down or get off. A collective, quiet sigh of relief went through the cabin. Surely she would now concede. Susan Pritchard's face turned a shade of mottled red. The public nature of the rebuke was a profound insult to her sense of status. Her eyes narrowed into slits. Fine, she said, her voice dangerously low. She turned not to George or Heather, but glared down the aisle. Her gaze landed on a young man in his early 20s, wearing a university sweatshirt and large headphones, sitting in seat 21G, a window seat. You, she barked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at him. You switch with me. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The young man, whose name was Ben, looked startled. He pulled off his headphones. I'm sorry. I'll take your seat. You take this one, she commanded, gesturing back towards 17B. I need a window seat. I feel claustrophobic. The lie was so transparent it was insulting. Before Ben could respond, Thatcher spoke up, unable to remain silent any longer. His voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. The young man doesn't have to do anything, and the issue is not claustrophobia. Susan whirled on him. You will not speak to me. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me, Thatcher replied, finally closing his book and placing it on his lap. He stood up, slowly unfolding to his full height. He wasn't aggressive, but his presence now filled the space. You have made it clear you are uncomfortable sitting next to a black man. Let's not hide behind excuses about windows and claustrophobia. Let's call it what it is, racism. The word hung in the air, stark and ugly. Susan gasped, clutching her pearls in a parody of shocked innocence. How dare you, my husband and I, donate to charities for underprivileged children? The non sequitur was so absurd it would have been laughable in any other context. Ben, the student from row 21, looked from Susan's contorted face to Thatcher's dignified calm. He looked at the weary flight attendants and the impatient passengers. He was just a kid on his way to a study abroad program, and he had been dragged into the center of this vortex of ugliness. It's fine, Ben said, his voice cracking slightly. I'll switch. I don't care where I sit. He just wanted it to be over. He started to gather his backpack. George, the purser, stepped in. Sir, you don't have to. No, it's okay, Ben insisted, already moving into the aisle. He wouldn't meet Thatcher's eyes, a look of shame and apology on his young face. He was capitulating not out of agreement with Susan, but out of a desire to extinguish the fire. Susan shot Thatcher a look of pure, triumphant victory. She had won. She had weaponized her privilege and prejudice, and had bent the will of the airline and its passengers to her own. Without another word, she swept past the still-standing Thatcher, not even bothering to thank Ben, and marched down the aisle to claim her new seat, 21G. Ben shuffled awkwardly into the now vacant seat, 17B. He sat down, buckled his seatbelt, and stared straight ahead, a knot of discomfort in his stomach. He offered a quiet, sorry man to Thatcher. Thatcher just nodded, the fight draining out of him replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion. He sat back down. The plane was finally moving. Susan Pritchard had gotten her way. The problem for the airline was solved, but for Thatcher, the flight to London was now shadowed by a familiar heavy cloud. With Susan Pritchard relocated and the boarding door finally sealed, a semblance of normalcy returned to the aircraft. The safety demonstration began its familiar choreography, a welcome distraction from the raw ugliness that had just transpired. As the Boeing 787 pushed back from the gate and taxied towards the runway, the cabin settled into the anonymous truce of air travel. Thatcher leaned his head against the cool window, watching the ground crew disappear as the plane aligned with the runway markers. The roar of the engines intensified, a powerful, all-encompassing vibration that surged through his seat. The plane accelerated, pressing him back. And then, with a feeling of impossible lightness, they were airborne, climbing steeply into the twilight over Texas. He felt Ben, the young student next to him, let out a long breath. That was insane, Ben muttered, loud enough for only Thatcher to hear. I'm really sorry. I didn't know what else to do. She was holding up the whole flight. Thatcher turned from the window. He saw genuine remorse in the young man's face. It's not your fault, Thatcher said, his voice low and reassuring. You did what you thought was best to de-escalate the situation. I appreciate the sentiment. She was out of line. Ben continued, shaking his head. Completely. I can't believe people still think like that, let alone say it out loud. Some people wear it like a badge of honor, Thatcher replied grimly, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. He didn't want to give Susan Pritchard another second of his mental energy. He had a 9-hour flight ahead of him, and he wanted to find some measure of peace. He offered Ben a small, tired smile. I'm Thatcher, by the way. Ben, nice to meet you under... well, you know. They shook hands, a small act of connection in the wake of a profound disconnection. A few rows back in seat 21G, Susan Pritchard was basking in her victory. She had stared down the airline staff, publicly shamed a man, and gotten exactly what she wanted. To her, this was a confirmation of her place in the world. Rules were for other people. Her comfort was paramount. She meticulously arranged her cashmere wrap, spritzed a bit of expensive perfume onto her wrists, and gave a curt, dismissive nod to her new seatmate a middle-aged salesman named Mr. Gallagher, who was trying to get some work done. She felt vindicated, powerful. She had restored order to her world. The first few hours of the flight passed without incident. The cabin lights were dimmed and the dinner service began. Heather, the flight attendant who had borne the brunt of Susan's initial tirade, moved down the aisle with the trolley. When she reached row 17, she gave Thatcher a look of sincere apology. "Dr. Robertson," she said, having seen the title on his boarding pass. "On behalf of the entire crew, I am so sorry for what happened during boarding. It was unacceptable." "It's not your fault, Heather," Thatcher assured her. "You handled it as professionally as you could. We've logged a full report. It will be escalated to corporate," she said, her voice dropping. Her behavior was beyond the pale. He simply nodded, accepting the chicken dinner she offered. He knew what a corporate report meant. Susan Pritchard might get a strongly worded email, or perhaps a temporary suspension of her gold card status if the airline felt particularly bold. But there would be no real consequences. The world would keep turning. He ate in silence, the food tasteless. He tried to read his book, but his mind kept replaying the scene. The sneer on her face, the word him. The collective discomfort of the other passengers, a mix of pity, annoyance, and a few scattered glimmers of solidarity. It was the story of his life distilled into a 10-minute confrontation in an airplane aisle. He was a respected cardiac surgeon, a leader in his field, a man who had dedicated his life to healing. Yet in that moment, to Susan Pritchard, none of that mattered. His degrees, his accomplishments, his character. They were all rendered invisible by the color of his skin. He felt a profound, bone-deep weariness settle over him. It wasn't anger anymore. Anger was a fire that burned out. This was a heavy, cold weight, the cumulative mass of 1,000 similar moments, 1,000 paper cuts to the soul. He eventually gave up on his book, put on his noise-cancelling headphones, and selected a mindless action movie from the in-flight entertainment system. He needed to turn his brain off. He needed to forget. Across the cabin, 4 rows back, Susan Pritchard finished her glass of Chardonnay, declined dessert, and reclined her seat. She felt a slight twinge in her chest, a familiar flutter of indigestion she attributed to the airline food. She took a small tablet from her purse, washed it down with water, and closed her eyes. She had a busy schedule in London meetings with decorators for their new flat in Knightsbridge, a gallery-opening dinner with Jonathan's colleagues. She needed her rest. The unpleasantness at the beginning of the flight was already fading from her memory, a trivial annoyance that had been swiftly and correctly dealt with. She drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, oblivious to the storm gathering within her own body. The flight droned on a silver needle, stitching its way across the black tapestry of the Atlantic night. The cabin was a cavern of slumbering shapes, illuminated by the faint, shifting glow of dozens of small screens. The only sounds were the constant, monotonous roar of the engines and the occasional cough or rustle of a blanket. Thatcher had long since abandoned his movie, finding it impossible to concentrate. He'd reclined his seat, closed his eyes, and tried to find solace in the darkness. But sleep remained elusive. His thoughts drifted to his patients, to the intricate dance of electrical impulses that governed the human heart. He thought of the fragility of it all, how a perfectly functioning system could be thrown into chaos in an instant by a blocked artery, a faulty valve, a genetic misprint. The heart was a marvel of biological engineering, but it was also profoundly vulnerable, much like the human spirit. He must have dozed off because he was jolted awake by a change in the cabin's atmosphere. It wasn't turbulence. It was a sound, a sharp, guttural gasp followed by a clatter. Thatcher's eyes snapped open. He sat up, his senses on high alert. A few rows back, a small overhead light flicked on, illuminating a scene of confusion. Gallagher, the salesman sitting next to Susan Pritchard, was on his feet, looking down with a panicked expression. "Help!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "I think she's having a seizure." "Somebody! Help!" Heads popped up over the tops of seats. A low murmur of alarm spread through the cabin like a current. Thatcher was already unbuckling his seatbelt before his brain had fully processed the situation. Heather and another flight attendant were rushing down the aisle from the galley. "What's going on?" Heather asked, her voice calm but urgent. "It's this woman," Mr. Gallagher stammered, pointing at the slumped figure of Susan Pritchard. She made this awful noise and started shaking. She knocked her water all over me." Thatcher was already there, pushing gently past the gathering onlookers. "Let me through," he said, his voice imbued with an authority that made people instinctively move aside. "I'm a doctor." Heather's eyes widened in recognition and relief. "Dr. Robertson, thank God." Thatcher knelt in the narrow aisle next to seat 21G. Susan was slumped against the window. Her face, which had been a mask of haughty composure just hours before, was now a terrifying shade of bluish grey. Her eyes were half open but vacant. She wasn't seizing. She was terrifyingly still. Her chest wasn't moving. The designer handbag had fallen to the floor, its contents spilling out. Thatcher pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, searching for the carotid artery. His touch was practiced, sure. He held his position for a few seconds, his expression grim. Nothing. Not a flicker. No pulse. "She's in cardiac arrest," he announced, his voice cutting through the rising panic in the cabin. There was no time for hesitation, no time for the bitter irony of the situation to settle in. A human life was extinguishing before his eyes, and the identity of that human was irrelevant. "Get her on the floor now," he commanded. Mr. Gallagher and another male passenger helped Thatcher carefully maneuver Susan's limp body from the seat and into the narrow confines of the aisle. She was frighteningly dead weight. "I need the aircraft's medical kit. The AED, now." Thatcher barked at Heather, not taking his eyes off Susan. "And tell the captain to contact Medlink. Tell them we have a witnessed cardiac arrest, female, late 50s. We are starting CPR." Heather, galvanized by his decisive commands, relayed the orders into the intercom. The other flight attendant sprinted to retrieve the emergency equipment. Thatcher positioned himself over Susan's body. He laced his fingers together, placed the heel of his hand on the center of her chest, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm was deep, forceful, and brutally methodical. It was a rhythm he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He was a cardiologist. He had done this hundreds of times in the pristine, controlled environment of a hospital. He had never done it like this on the floor of a moving airplane, with the roar of the engines in his ears and the terrified faces of strangers staring down at him. And he had never, ever done it on a person who just a few hours earlier had looked at him with such profound and undisguised hatred. But as he pushed down on Susan Pritchard's sternum, forcing blood to her brain, that irony was a distant, meaningless echo. Right now, she wasn't the woman from seat 17B. She was his patient, and he was not going to let her die. The aisle of the Boeing 787 transformed into a makeshift emergency room. The hushed atmosphere of the sleeping cabin had been shattered, replaced by a focused electric tension. The only sounds were Thatcher's strained grunts with each chest compression, the frantic rustling of the flight attendant opening the medical kit, and the terrified whispers of the passengers. Ben from seat 17B watched with wide, disbelieving eyes. He saw the man he'd spoken with just a few hours ago. The calm, dignified victim of a racist tirade, now fighting with every ounce of his strength to save the life of his tormentor. The karmic whiplash of the situation was staggering. The flight attendant returned with a red case containing the automated external defibrillator AED and a more comprehensive medical kit. "Here," she said, her voice breathless. "Open the AED and attach the pads," Thatcher commanded between compressions, his rhythm never faltering. "One on the upper right chest, the other on the lower left side. You know the drill." Heather knelt opposite him, her hands surprisingly steady as she tore open the sealed packets containing the electrode pads. She ripped open the front of Susan's expensive silk blouse to expose her chest, her movements swift and professional. Thatcher continued the brutal, life-sustaining rhythm of CPR. 30 compressions, then 2 breaths. He muttered more to himself than anyone else. He tilted Susan's head back, pinched her nose, and delivered 2 rescue breaths using a pocket mask from the kit. Her chest rose slightly. He immediately went back to compressions. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping onto the cheap airplane carpet. "Pads are on," Heather confirmed. The AED's synthesized voice filled the small space. "Analyzing heart rhythm. Do not touch the patient." Thatcher pulled his hands away, his body screaming from the exertion. For a few seconds, everything hung in limbo. The passengers held their breath. "Shock advised," the machine announced. "Charging. Stand clear. Push the orange button now." "Everybody clear," Thatcher shouted, his voice hoarse. He made sure no one was touching Susan. He glanced at her face. It was still a waxy, lifeless mask. He pressed the flashing orange button. Susan Pritchard's body arched violently off the floor as the electrical current shot through her heart, a grotesque, involuntary spasm. Then she fell back limp. "Resume CPR," the AED commanded. Thatcher was on her chest again, instantly pumping, forcing life back into a body that was trying to abandon it. The cycle repeated 2 minutes of relentless compressions followed by the AED's analysis. "No shock advised," the machine said after the next cycle. Thatcher's heart sank. That wasn't good. It meant her heart wasn't in a shockable rhythm like ventricular fibrillation. It could mean a systola, a flatline. A much more grim prognosis. "Don't stop," he told himself. He pushed harder. "I've got the captain on the line for you," Heather said, holding out the intercom phone. Thatcher shook his head, never breaking his rhythm. "You talk to him. Tell him she's still in arrest. We got 1 shock in, but now she's in a non-shockable rhythm. Ask Medlink what they have in the advanced kit. I need an IV line. I need epinephrine. I need to know what drugs we have on this plane." His mind was racing, cataloguing possibilities. A massive heart attack, a myocardial infarction was most likely. A pulmonary embolism was another. Without diagnostic equipment, he was flying blind, relying on his training, his instincts, and the very limited tools at his disposal. He called over his shoulder, "You, Ben, can you help?" Ben scrambled out of his seat. "Yes, what do you need? When I give breaths, I need you to take over compressions. Have you ever done CPR? I did a class in high school, but it's better than nothing. Just push hard and fast in the center of the chest, to the beat of Stayin' Alive. You know the song?" Ben nodded, his face pale but determined. For the next 10 minutes they worked in a grim tandem. Thatcher would deliver breaths and manage the equipment, while Ben, clumsy but earnest, took over the grueling task of compressions. The salesman, Mr. Gallagher, held a small flashlight illuminating the scene. Other passengers handed them bottles of water. The artificial barriers of class and race had dissolved in the face of a raw, universal human drama, the fight for a single breath. Heather came back, her face grave. Medlink confirms we have a vial of epinephrine and IV setup, but they said only a qualified physician can administer it. That's you. Get it, Thatcher ordered. As Heather rummaged through the larger medical chest, Thatcher took over compressions from an exhausted Ben. He felt a flicker under his fingers, a flutter. It was gone as soon as it came, but it was there. I think I felt a pulse, he said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through his fatigue. He stopped compressions for a moment and checked her carotid artery again. There it was, faint, thready, and dangerously fast. But it was there. A spontaneous return of circulation. She has a pulse, he announced. The relief in the cabin was a palpable physical wave. She's not breathing on her own, though. I still need to breathe for her. He looked at Susan's face. A tiny bit of color had returned to her lips. Her life for now had been pulled back from the brink. It was hanging by the thinnest of threads, a thread held firmly in the hands of the man she had deemed unworthy to even sit beside. Her life was in his hands, and his alone. The return of a pulse was not a victory. It was merely the beginning of a new, more delicate battle. Susan Pritchard was alive, but she was unconscious, unstable, and utterly dependent on the man kneeling over her. The next few hours would determine whether the flicker of life he had coaxed back would strengthen into a flame or be extinguished forever over the cold, dark ocean. Okay, we need to secure her. Thatcher, said his mind, shifting from resuscitation to critical care. We need to get her out of the main aisle. Working with the flight crew and a few passenger volunteers, they carefully moved Susan into the wider galley area near the exit doors, laying her on a bed of blankets and pillows. It offered more space and a small degree of privacy from the prying eyes of the entire plane. Heather handed him the advanced medical kit. Thatcher's hands, slick with sweat, worked with practiced efficiency. He found the small vial of epinephrine, a drug that could help support her blood pressure and heart rate. He expertly inserted an IV line into a vein on the back of her hand. A difficult task on a stable patient in a well-lit hospital, let alone on a moving aircraft. I need someone to keep her head tilted back to maintain her airway, he instructed. Heather immediately took on the role. And someone else needs to monitor her pulse every 2 minutes and tell me the rate. Ben, looking less terrified and more focused, stepped up, placing 2 fingers on Susan's neck, as Thatcher had shown him. The captain's voice came over the intercom, this time addressed to the whole cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. As you are aware, we have a serious medical emergency on board. We have a doctor assisting the passenger, and we are in constant communication with medical professionals on the ground. We have altered our course and will be making an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport, which is St. John's International in Newfoundland. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 2 hours. We apologize for the diversion and thank you for your cooperation and understanding. A wave of murmurs went through the plane. Vacations would be delayed. Connecting flights would be missed. But no one complained. The drama unfolding in the galley had put everything into stark perspective. For Thatcher, those 2 hours were an eternity. He was functioning on pure adrenaline and years of training. He administered the epinephrine, carefully calculating the dose. He continued to assist Susan's breathing with the bag valve mask, a physically demanding task that required a constant, steady rhythm. Ben's voice was a metronome in the background. Pulse is 120. A few minutes later, it's dropping, 110. Then it's speeding up again, 130. Thatcher was essentially acting as a human life support machine. He was her heart, her lungs, her pharmacist. He was constantly assessing, checking the color of her skin, the response of her pupils to the light from his pen, the strength of her fragile pulse. At one point, Susan's eyelids fluttered. A low moan escaped her lips. Her eyes opened, but they were unfocused, clouded with confusion and pain. They darted around the galley, at the concerned faces of the flight attendants, at the emergency equipment, and then they settled on him. They settled on Dr. Thatcher Robertson. Her brow furrowed. There was a flicker of something in her gaze. Not hatred anymore, but a profound, terrifying confusion. It was as if her brain was struggling to reconcile the man she had scorned with the man whose face was now inches from hers, the man whose hands were literally keeping her alive. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes wide with fear, and a dawning, horrified understanding locked with his. Thatcher didn't flinch. He didn't offer a reassuring smile or a word of comfort. He couldn't. He was too focused. He met her gaze with a look of pure clinical professionalism. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "You've had a cardiac arrest. You are on a plane. We are diverting to get you to a hospital. Do not try to talk. Just concentrate on breathing." Her eyes filled with tears which tracked down her temples and into her perfectly coiffed hair. The mask of superiority had shattered, leaving behind only raw, primal fear. She knew. In that moment of semi-lucidity, she understood the totality of the situation. Her life was in the hands of the man she had dehumanized. The supreme irony was a weight more crushing than any medical prognosis. She closed her eyes, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path through her expensive foundation. The descent into St. John's was rapid. Thatcher could feel the change in pressure, the shifting angle of the floor. He never stopped working. The flight attendants cleared the area, preparing the main door for the arrival of the paramedics. As the plane touched down on the tarmac with a jolt, a smattering of applause broke out in the cabin, not for the pilot's landing, but for the doctor in the aisle. Thatcher didn't even notice. His entire world was focused on the patient in front of him. The engines powered down and the seatbelt sign pinged off, but no one moved. Everyone remained seated, watching the galley doors. Seconds later, they burst open, and a team of Canadian paramedics, their faces grim and professional, stormed onto the plane with a stretcher and a trove of equipment. The lead paramedic knelt beside Thatcher. "What do we have?" Thatcher, exhausted but precise, gave his report. It was a perfect, concise medical handover. Female late 50s witnessed V-fib arrest. One shock delivered via onboard AED with return of spontaneous circulation. Has been hypotensive, received 1 dose of IPI via IV. She's maintaining her own pulse, but requires respiratory support. Unconscious for the most part, but semi-lucid for a moment, a few minutes ago. The paramedic nodded, impressed. "You're a doctor." "Cardiologist," Thatcher replied finally, allowing himself to sag back against the wall of the galley. "Good work, Doc," the paramedic said, already hooking Susan up to their heart monitor and oxygen. "You saved her life. We'll take it from here." As the team efficiently loaded Susan onto the stretcher, wrapping her in blankets and securing her with straps, she opened her eyes one last time. Her gaze sought out Thatcher in the crowded galley. There was no confusion this time. There was only a look of profound, silent, and agonizing shame. She was wheeled off the plane and out into the cold Newfoundland night, leaving a trail of stunned silence in her wake. The moment the paramedics wheeled Susan Pritchard through the doorway and into the biting cold of the Newfoundland night, the pressurized seal of the aircraft seemed to hold in a collective suspended breath. The intense life-or-death focus that had consumed the cabin for 2 agonizing hours vanished, leaving a strange and hollow echo in its place. The galley, which had become a theater of operations, was suddenly just a galley. Again, a small, cramped space littered with the detritus of a saved life. Discarded saline bags, ripped foil packaging from the AED pads, and the faint, sterile scent of antiseptic clashing with the stale, recycled air. Dr. Thatcher Robertson remained where he was, his back pressed against the cool metal of a service compartment. The adrenaline that had sharpened his senses and fueled his actions was now draining away, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. A fine tremor started in his hands, a physical manifestation of the immense strain he had been under. His knees ached from kneeling on the thin carpet. His back screamed from the awkward angle of performing compressions, and his mind, after hours of hyper-focused calculation, felt terrifyingly blank. He felt a presence beside him and looked up to see Captain Frank Miller, his captain's hat held respectfully in his hands. The man's face, etched with the lines of decades spent in command, was filled with an expression that went beyond simple gratitude. It was awe. Dr. Robertson. Captain Miller began, his voice low and steady, yet thick with emotion. I've been flying for 35 years. I thought I'd seen everything. I haven't. Not until tonight. I have no official words that can adequately express the debt of gratitude we owe you. So from one man to another, thank you. What you did here was nothing short of miraculous. Thatcher could only manage a slow, tired nod, the words still failing to form. We also owe you a profound apology. The captain continued, his gaze unwavering. What transpired during boarding was a failure on our part. It was a disgrace to our uniform and to basic human decency. I allowed a passenger's prejudice to dictate the terms, and it never should have escalated. The official report will reflect that, I assure you. Your professionalism first in the face of that bigotry, and then in the face of this crisis has been, well, it has been humbling to witness. Before Thatcher could respond, Mr. Gallagher, the salesman who had been sitting beside Susan, appeared at the edge of the galley. His face was ashen. He looked at Thatcher, then at the spot on the floor where his seatmate had lain, and back to Thatcher. I was right there, the salesman said, his voice barely a whisper. She was talking about redecorating her London flat 1 minute and the next. She was gone. Just gone. And you pulled her back. I watched you. I've never seen anything like it. He extended a slightly trembling hand. I just wanted to shake the hand of the man who did that. Thatcher took his hand, and the man's grip was surprisingly firm, a wordless transfer of respect and shock. One by one, a few other passengers approached, not with loud congratulations, but with a quiet, reverent deference. An older woman simply touched his arm and whispered, "God bless you, son." The young couple from across the aisle gave him a look of pure wonder. It wasn't the praise that struck Thatcher. It was the silence that surrounded it. They had all been party to Susan's initial assault, silent observers in a theater of prejudice. Now they were silent witnesses in a theater of redemption, and they seemed to understand the gravity of both scenes. Ben, the young student, was the last to approach. He lingered, shifting his weight 1,000 questions in his wide eyes. Is she, after all, will she be okay? He finally asked. Thatcher met the young man's gaze, seeing the honest concern there. She has a chance, he said, his voice finding its footing. A good one. The paramedics have advanced drugs life support. They'll get her to a cardiac unit. What matters is that we got her heart beating again. We gave the hospital something to work with. You helped do that, Ben. Don't forget it. But how did you do it? Ben pressed his voice, full of a desperate need to understand. After what she said, how she treated you. How do you just switch that off and save her? Thatcher considered the question. It was the crux of the entire night. He looked down at his own hands, still marked with the faint red imprints from the force of the compressions. When you're a doctor, he said slowly, you take an oath. The oath isn't about the patient's character. It's about yours. It doesn't ask if they are a good person or a kind person. It just asks you to act. You don't save them because of who they are. You save them because of who you are. The word settled in the quiet galley, more powerful than any medical explanation. Heather appeared at his side with a cold bottle of water and a warm, damp towel. Her composure was back, but her eyes were red-rimmed. Dr. Robertson, we have you to thank for a life. And I have you to thank for my faith in people. She didn't say any more, but the shared memory of the confrontation during boarding hung between them now, bookended by this incredible act of grace. After the authorities in St. John's cleared the aircraft, the flight resumed its journey to London. Thatcher returned to seat 17C. The cabin was profoundly changed. The usual hum of activity on a long-haul flight was gone. No one laughed loudly at their movies. Conversations were held in hushed tones. Every time a flight attendant walked down the aisle, their eyes would flick to Thatcher, a quick check-in, a silent offer of anything he might need. He was no longer an anonymous passenger. He was the guardian of the flight. He couldn't sleep. He tried to close his eyes, but all he could see was Susan's ashen face. All he could feel was the grim rhythm of CPR under his hands. He replayed every step, every decision, every second. Did I start compressions fast enough? Was the IV line clean? Should I have given the epi sooner? It was the doctor's curse, the relentless internal post-mortem, the search for an impossible perfection. When the plane finally descended through the thick morning clouds over England, landing with a gentle bump at Heathrow, the exhaustion had settled deep into his bones. He waited as he always did for the cabin to empty. He watched the other passengers file out, many of them nodding or making eye contact with him one last time, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared. He was the last person to walk out of the cabin. In the sterile, impersonal corridor of the jet bridge, a place of transient hellos and goodbyes. Captain Miller and the entire flight crew were waiting. They stood in a neat line, their uniforms crisp, their faces tired but full of sincere respect. As he stepped out, they began to clap. It wasn't loud or performative, but a soft rhythmic applause that echoed in the enclosed space, a private, profound thank you from the people who understood the stakes better than anyone. Thatcher paused, overwhelmed for the first time that night. He could only nod, a lump forming in his throat, before continuing his walk toward passport control. He never saw Susan Pritchard again. He never received a letter from her influential husband, Jonathan Pritchard, of Pritchard, Klein and Associates. No fruit basket arrived at his London hotel. No donation was made in his name. He didn't expect any of it. He knew that for her to thank him, she would have to acknowledge the depth of her own ugliness, a reckoning that was perhaps more terrifying than any cardiac arrest. Later, sitting on the train into Paddington, watching the grey, rain-streaked world rush by, he reflected on the night. The karma that had visited Susan Pritchard at 37,000 feet had been swift, brutal, and terrifyingly precise. It had stripped her of her status, her wealth, her privilege, and her voice leaving her utterly helpless. But the story didn't end there. Because the grace that had answered her silent, desperate plea, a grace that wore the face of the man she had despised, was in its own quiet way just as absolute. It asked for nothing in return. It simply acted. And in the moral calculus of the universe, Thatcher suspected that was the force that truly kept the world in balance. The silence on that plane after Susan Pritchard was wheeled away spoke volumes, a testament to a night of shocking prejudice and even more shocking heroism. Dr. Thatcher Robertson wasn't looking for praise. He was simply being what he was, a doctor, a professional, a man whose character was infinitely stronger than the hatred he faced. This story is a stark reminder that our true selves are not revealed when things are easy, but when we are tested. It shows how quickly our arrogance and prejudices can be humbled by the fragility of our own lives, and how grace can appear in the most unexpected of forms. If this story of intense karma and ultimate professionalism moved you, please honor the real-life heroes like Dr. Robertson by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see the power of integrity in action. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. We want to hear from you. What would you have done in the doctor's shoes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening.